The air in the dimly lit sanctuary smelled of crushed white roses and expensive perfume, a scent that usually brought comfort but today felt strangely suffocating. Arthur stood at the altar, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo, his hands trembling slightly despite the calm exterior he forced himself to project. In less than 10 minutes, he would be a married man again, binding his life to Clara, a woman who had appeared in his world like a sudden, dazzling ray of light after years of absolute emotional ruin. His past marriage to Julianne had ended in a tempest of bitter silence and sudden disappearance, leaving him scarred, cynical, and deeply untrusting of love. Yet Clara had undone all of that with her gentle laugh, her fiercely private nature, and her unwavering devotion. She was his second chance, his redemption, a clean slate completely untethered from the wreckage of his past. The music began to swell, a low, resonant chord from the pipe organ that signaled the arrival of the bride, and Arthur took a deep breath, fixing his gaze on the heavy oak doors at the back of the church. When the doors swung open, the breath caught entirely in his throat, not just from the beauty of the moment, but from a sudden, inexplicable tightening in his chest. Clara walked down the aisle alone, her silhouette framed by the bright afternoon light pouring in from the courtyard behind her. She had chosen a traditional vintage gown with a thick, intricate lace veil that completely obscured her face, a choice she had insisted upon for the sake of old-world romance. As she drew closer, the contrast between the celebratory smiles of the guests and the mounting, irrational dread inside Arthur grew starker. There was something about the way she shifted her weight, a subtle asymmetry in her posture, that felt hauntingly, terrifyingly familiar. It was an echo of a ghost he had spent 3 years trying to exorcise from his mind. He told himself it was just pre-wedding jitters, the natural anxiety of a man who had already failed once at the altar, but the feeling refused to dissolve. She reached the altar, her gloved hand slipping into his, and though her touch was warm, a distinct chill settled deep into Arthur's bones as the minister began to speak the opening blessings. The ceremony progressed in a blur of traditional liturgy and murmured responses, every second stretching out like pulled glass as Arthur struggled to maintain his focus. He kept his eyes locked on the lace fabric hiding Clara's features, desperately searching for the reassuring contours of the woman he had courted for the past 14 months. They had met in a bustling, rain-slicked city miles away from his hometown, a place where no one knew his history or the name of his ex-wife. Clara had been a clean break from the past, never asking about his previous life, and rarely speaking of her own estranged family, claiming they had cut ties after a bitter inheritance dispute years ago. Arthur had respected her privacy, seeing in her a mirrored reflection of his own desire to bury the past and build a future from nothing. But standing here now, the silence between her words felt less like a shared understanding and more like a carefully constructed wall. The minister finally reached the moment of the binding vows, gesturing toward the heavy mahogany table where the official marriage license lay open, waiting for the final, legal signatures that would seal their union before God and the state. Arthur stepped forward first, taking the silver pen from the minister's outstretched hand, his eyes scanning down the crisp, white document to find the line designated for his signature. His gaze naturally drifted upward to the line immediately above his, where the bride's full legal name was neatly printed in elegant, sweeping calligraphy. Time seemed to violently fracture, the ambient sound of the church dropping into a dead, ringing silence as the letters burned themselves into his retinas. The name written there was not Clara Vance. The document read, in clear, unmistakable ink, Evelyn Julianne Vance. The world tilted beneath Arthur's feet. Julianne's maiden name had been Vance, a detail he had long buried, but Evelyn was a name he had only ever heard whispered in bitter, hushed arguments during the darkest days of his first marriage. Evelyn was the brilliant, estranged younger sister who had moved abroad a decade ago, the sibling Julianne had fiercely envied and systematically erased from every family photograph. The woman he was standing next to, the woman he had shared his bed, his secrets, and his heart with for over a year, was not a stranger who had saved him. She was the blood sister of the woman who had ruined him. Arthur stood frozen, the pen hovering uselessly over the paper, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird as the horrific weight of the deception crashed down upon him. He slowly turned his head to look at the veiled figure beside him, his mind screaming for an explanation as the realization settled in, his entire second chance at happiness was a meticulously calculated lie. The silence stretched so long that the minister cleared his throat, a sharp, dry sound that cut through the heavy air of the chapel. Arthur stood paralyzed, his eyes darting between the stark black ink on the marriage license and the veiled woman standing mere inches away from him. The name Evelyn Julianne Vance seemed to pulse on the paper, a physical manifestation of a trap he had blindly walked into. Guests in the front pews began to shift uncomfortably. The soft rustle of silk and whispered confusion creating a low hum of static in his ears. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room pressing into his back, waiting for him to lower the pen and sign his life away to a ghost. He looked at Clara, no, Evelyn, searching for any sign of hesitation in her posture, but she stood completely still, her hands clasped elegantly in front of her vintage gown, perfectly serene under the heavy lace. Arthur, the minister whispered, leaning forward slightly, his eyes conveying a gentle, pastoral concern. Is everything all right? Arthur's mind raced through the timeline of their entire relationship, frantically pulling at the threads of the last 14 months. Every coincidence, every avoided question, and every sudden shift in conversation now took on a sinister, calculated clarity. He remembered how she had insisted on a small, private wedding with no family present, claiming her relatives were toxic and long dead to her. He remembered how she always steered him away from certain parts of the city, and how she had never once allowed him to see her childhood passport or birth certificate, laughing it off as a quirk of her extreme identity security. It hadn't been a quirk. It had been a shield to keep him from discovering the truth. The contrast between the woman he thought he loved and the architect of this deception was staggering. He felt a violent surge of anger, followed immediately by a paralyzing dread. Why had she done this? Was this Julianne's ultimate revenge, a long con designed to completely destroy whatever sanity he had left? He slowly lowered the silver pen, the metal clicking softly against the polished wood of the table. He couldn't sign it. To sign this document was to willingly step into a cage built by the family that had already broken him once. He turned his body fully toward her, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely carried past the altar. "Lift your veil," he commanded, the raw emotion in his tone cutting through the celebratory atmosphere like a knife. The veiled figure stiffened. For the first time all afternoon, her perfect composure cracked. Her hands trembled, her fingers tightening around her bridal bouquet until the stems groaned under the pressure. The minister looked shocked, stepping back slightly as the tension between the couple became undeniable. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows of the congregation. The groom was demanding to see his bride's face before the vows were even completed. "Arthur, please," she whispered back, her voice muffled by the thick fabric but carrying a desperate, pleading edge that he had never heard before. "Not here. Just sign the paper, and I will explain everything tonight. I swear to you, I will explain everything. Just trust me." "Trust you?" Arthur's laugh was sharp, devoid of any warmth, a sound that made the minister step back even further. "You want me to trust a woman who doesn't even use her real name? Look at the license, Clara. Or should I call you Evelyn? Or maybe I should just call you Julianne's shadow." The mention of her sister's name caused her to take a sharp breath, her shoulders sagging as if a massive physical weight had just been dropped onto them. The illusion was completely shattered. The audience behind them was now in full murmur, family members leaning across aisles, cell phones being subtly raised, and a palpable sense of scandal filling the sacred space. The fairy tale wedding had transformed into a public execution of trust. Arthur reached out, his hand steady despite the fury burning inside him, and gripped the edge of the heavy lace veil. He didn't wait for her permission. With one swift, decisive motion, he threw the veil back, exposing her face to the harsh, unforgiving light of the church. The woman standing before him was undeniably the woman he had fallen in love with, but the expression on her face was entirely unrecognizable. Tears were already streaming down her flushed cheeks, her mascara running in dark, jagged lines down her pale skin. But it wasn't just sadness in her eyes, it was a profound, suffocating terror. She looked at him not with the malice of a con artist caught in a lie, but with the desperation of someone who knew her life was about to end. And as Arthur stared at her, his gaze drifted to the delicate gold chain around her neck, a necklace she had always kept hidden beneath her high-collared shirts during their courtship. Hanging from the chain was a small, tarnished silver key, a key that Arthur recognized instantly. It was the exact key to the private safe Julianne had stolen from his home 3 years ago, the safe containing the documents that could ruin his entire family legacy. The web was far larger, and far more dangerous, than a simple case of mistaken identity. The sight of the tarnished silver key resting against Evelyn's collarbone sent a wave of icy adrenaline straight to Arthur's heart. That key belonged to the heavy iron lockbox his grandfather had passed down to him, a repository of corporate secrets, land deeds, and sensitive financial arrangements that kept his family's logistics empire afloat. When Julianne had vanished 3 years ago, she hadn't just broken his heart, she had gutted his security, taking the box and leaving him vulnerable to ruin. For 3 years, he had lived in constant fear of blackmail, wondering when the other shoe would drop. Now, seeing the key around the neck of the woman he loved, the pieces of a horrific puzzle began to violently snap together. This wasn't a romance, it was a targeted corporate espionage operation execution. "Arthur, please, let us leave this room," Evelyn begged, her voice cracking as she took a half-step toward him, reaching out with a gloved hand. "It's not what you think. I didn't take it from you." Arthur recoiled from her touch as if she were venomous. He turned to the minister, whose face had gone completely pale. "The wedding is over," Arthur announced, his voice booming through the vaulted ceilings of the sanctuary, cutting through the frantic whispers of the crowd. He didn't look back at the sea of shocked faces in the pews. He grabbed Evelyn roughly by the wrist, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to ensure she didn't vanish into the night the way her sister had, and dragged her toward the side vestry door, slamming the heavy oak which shut behind them. The vestry was small, suffocatingly quiet, and smelled of old paper and incense. The sudden absence of the crowd magnified the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 people trapped inside. Arthur let go of her wrist and backed away, leaning against a storage cabinet, his eyes fixed on the silver key. "Start talking," Arthur hissed, his voice trembling with a lethal mixture of betrayal and rage. "Is Julianne waiting outside? Is she in the car? Did the 2 of you sit around a table and plan how you were going to finish me off? Did you laugh every time I told you I loved you, knowing you were just waiting to get your hands on the rest of my life?" Evelyn collapsed against a small velvet chair, her pristine wedding gown billowing around her like a deflated balloon. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she sobbed. "Julianne is dead, Arthur," she whispered into her palms. The word struck the room like a physical blow. Arthur froze, the breath leaving his lungs. "What?" Evelyn lowered her hands, her eyes red, swollen, and filled with a profound, exhausting grief. "She's been dead for 2 years. She died in a private clinic in Switzerland. Overdose, Arthur. She spent every single dime she stole from you trying to outrun her demons, and when the money ran out, she realized she had nowhere left to go." Arthur shook his head, refusing to let down his guard. "No. No, I don't believe you. If she's dead, why are you here? Why did you change your name to Clara? Why do you have the key to my family's ruin hanging around your neck?" "Because Julianne didn't act alone," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly steady whisper as she reached behind her neck, unhooking the gold chain and holding the silver key out toward him. "She was a pawn, Arthur. Just like you were. And just like I was supposed to be." Arthur stepped forward, tearing the key from her hand. "A pawn for whom?" "For Victor Vance. Our father," Evelyn revealed, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. "Julianne didn't take your lockbox because she hated you. She took it because our father threatened to expose her addictions and have her institutionalized if she didn't deliver your family's financial vulnerabilities to him. Victor has been trying to absorb your logistics company for a decade. But Julianne hid the box from him before she died. She realized too late what he was going to do with it." Evelyn stood up, stepping closer to Arthur, the contrast between her fragile appearance and the fierce determination in her eyes striking him to the core. "She sent this key to me right before she passed away, along with a journal detailing everything Victor had forced her to do. I didn't come to you to destroy you, Arthur. I came to protect you. I changed my name to Clara because my father had men tracking me, trying to find where Julianne hid the box. I needed to get close to you, to find a way to give you the box back without my father realizing I had broken alignment with him. But I fell in love with you. I really, truly fell in love with you. Arthur stared at her, his mind spinning out of control. The narrative was shifting too fast, the ground liquefying beneath his feet. If you loved me, you would have told me the truth on day one. If I told you on day one, you would have handed me over to the police, and my father would have bought the evidence from the state storage within an hour. Evelyn countered, her voice rising in desperation. I had to be sure. I had to secure the box myself. And where is it? Arthur demanded, stepping into her space, his heart pounding. Where is the box right now, Evelyn? Evelyn looked at him, a tear slipping down her cheek as she delivered the final blow to his understanding of the situation. It's not in Switzerland, and it's not in a safety deposit box, Arthur. It's in the trunk of the car parked directly behind this church. The car my father's driver brought here today. The air in the vestry turned completely to ice. Arthur stared at Evelyn, the silver key in his palm suddenly feeling hot enough to burn through his skin. The implication of her words settled into the room like a suffocating fog. If the lockbox, the ultimate weapon against his family's survival, was currently sitting in the trunk of a car managed by Victor Vance's personal driver, then this wedding wasn't just a compromised ceremony. It was an ambush. The driver, Arthur whispered, the reality of the trap fully crystallizing in his mind. Thomas. He's been working for your family this entire time. The man who drove you to the church today. Evelyn nodded frantically, wiping a smear of mascara from her cheek with the back of her silk glove. My father doesn't know I have the key, Arthur. He thinks I've been tracking it down just like his other operatives. I told him I needed his most trusted transport to ensure the assets arrived safely at the venue. Pretending I was going to hand the box over to him after we signed the marriage certificate. Victor thinks the marriage was my way of legally locking down your estate before he executes the corporate takeover. He has no idea that my entire plan was to sign the papers, gain the legal right to transfer your assets out of his reach, and hand you the box the moment we were alone. You expect me to believe you played a double game against a man as ruthless as Victor Vance? For me. Arthur's voice was laced with profound skepticism, his mind warring between the deep affection he had felt for Clara and the terrifying reality of Evelyn. You framed our entire relationship around a corporate execution. Look at the contrast of our lives, Arthur. Evelyn cried out, stepping closer, her eyes flashing with a desperate sincerity. He destroyed Julianne. He turned my sister into a thief, an addict, and a ghost before she even turned 30. I hated him long before I ever met you. When Julianne died in that clinic, she didn't leave me an inheritance, she left me a curse and a confession. I knew what he did to your family, how he engineered the supply chain strikes that nearly bankrupted your father 5 years ago. I didn't just want to save you. I wanted to castrate my father's empire so completely that he could never hurt another human being again. Before Arthur could process the revelation of his father's past corporate sabotage, a heavy, rhythmic knocking echoed against the vestry door. The sound was deliberate, authoritative, and entirely devoid of the panic that was currently consuming the wedding guests out in the main sanctuary. Arthur held his breath, his hand instinctively moving to block Evelyn from the door. Who is it? He called out, his voice forced into a stern, defensive posture. Arthur, my boy, a deep, resonant voice boomed through the thick wood. It was a voice Arthur had heard in boardroom negotiations and high-stakes economic summits, but never expected to hear at his own wedding. It was Victor Vance. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes widened in absolute terror. She shrunk back against the wall, her beautiful vintage gown catching on the edge of the wooden cabinetry. He's here, she mouthed silently. He wasn't supposed to be here until the reception. Arthur walked toward the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a war drum. He unlocked the heavy iron latch and pulled the door open just enough to frame his own imposing figure, blocking the view of the weeping bride behind him. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Victor Vance, a man in his late 60s with sharp, predatory gray eyes, a meticulously tailored charcoal suit, and a silver-headed walking cane that he leaned on with calculated elegance. Behind him stood Thomas, the driver, holding a sleek black leather briefcase. "Victor," Arthur said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the warmth usually reserved for an impending father-in-law. "I don't recall seeing your name on the guest list. I believe Clara made it very clear that her family was not welcome." Victor offered a cold, humorless smile, his eyes darting past Arthur's shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of his daughter. "A father doesn't need an invitation to his own daughter's triumph, Arthur. Or should I say, his daughter's tragic miscalculation." Victor stepped forward, forcing Arthur to either yield the doorway or instigate a physical altercation. Arthur stood his ground, but Victor merely leaned in, his voice dropping to a gravelly, triumphant whisper. "You can stop the theatrics, Arthur. The ceremony is ruined, the guests are leaving, and my daughter's little counterplot has officially reached its expiration date," Victor murmured, gesturing slightly to the briefcase Thomas held. "Did Evelyn tell you she was saving you? Did she tell you the lockbox was in the trunk? Such a romantic, foolish girl. She always lacked Julianne's predatory instincts." Arthur's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the edge of the door. "What are you talking about?" Victor signaled to Thomas, who stepped forward and popped the heavy brass latches on the briefcase, tilting it open toward Arthur. Inside lay the contents of the grandfather's lockbox, the original land deeds, the offshore account routing numbers, and the highly classified logistics blueprints that kept Arthur's entire empire functioning. They weren't in the car trunk. They had already been harvested. "Evelyn thought she was playing chess with me," Victor chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that filled the corridor with malice. "She assumed I trusted her. But I've had her phones tapped since she left Switzerland. I knew she was trying to return the box to you. I let her play the part of the loving savior, let her guide you right to the altar, because I needed you distracted, isolated, and completely focused on a second chance at love while my team systematically dismantled your secondary shell corporations. The moment she entered this church today, Thomas emptied the trunk. Your empire belongs to the Vance Group now, Arthur." Signed, sealed, and delivered, without a single vow being spoken. The revelation hung in the air like a lethal toxin, suffocating the last remnants of hope in the small vestry. Arthur stared into the open briefcase, the stark contrast between the beautifully preserved family documents and the absolute ruin they represented shattering his reality. The blueprints, the deeds, the legacy his grandfather had spent a lifetime building, all of it was reduced to a trophy in the hands of a predator. He felt a profound, hollow numbness wash over him, a silence louder than any explosion. He had spent years running from the ghost of his first marriage, only to sprint directly into a trap designed by the exact same architect. Behind him, a choked, broken sound echoed through the room. Evelyn stepped forward, her footsteps heavy and dragging, the beautiful vintage lace of her gown rustling against the cold stone floor. She looked past Arthur, her eyes locking onto her father's triumphant face, and then down to the briefcase. The realization that her grand plan to avenge her sister and save the man she loved had been nothing more than a pre-scripted chapter in Victor's playbook broke something deep inside her. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with an overwhelming, crushing despair. "The whole time, you just let me believe I was winning." "Of course I knew, Evelyn," Victor said, his tone casual, almost bored, as he signaled Thomas to close the briefcase. The sharp snap of the brass latches sounded like a gavel falling on Arthur's life. "You were always too emotional, just like Julianne. You thought love was a weapon you could use against me. But love isn't a weapon, my dear. It's a vulnerability. It makes men blind, and it makes women predictable." Victor turned his cold, gray eyes back to Arthur, giving a dismissive, aristocratic nod. "Goodbye, Arthur. Thank you for the company. Do try to take better care of your next asset." With that, Victor turned on his heel, his silver-headed cane clicking rhythmically against the floorboards as he and Thomas vanished down the dark corridor, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of rain and absolute ruin. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing Arthur and Evelyn back into the suffocating silence of the vestry. The world outside was moving on, the muffled sounds of crying guests, cars starting in the parking lot, and the distant, mocking toll of the church bells signaled the end of a wedding that never truly was. Arthur didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the blank wood of the door, his hands clenched so tightly into fists that his knuckles turned stark white. The silver key was still pressed hard into his palm, a useless piece of metal that unlocked a box that was already empty. Arthur. Evelyn's voice cracked, a fragile, weeping sound that cut through the silence. She reached out, her gloved fingers trembling violently as she gently touched his shoulder. Arthur, I am so sorry. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could save us. Arthur slowly turned around to look at her. The anger that had consumed him minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, exhausting sorrow. He looked at her tear-stained face, the ruined mascara, the vintage dress that was supposed to symbolize their beautiful, untethered future. He realized then the ultimate, cruel irony of their story: she hadn't been trying to destroy him. She loved him. She had risked everything to fight the monster that had killed her sister, and in doing so, she had accidentally handed that monster everything he needed to finish the job. They were two broken people who had tried to build a sanctuary out of lies, only to watch it collapse under the weight of the past. We never had a chance, did we? Arthur said, his voice dropping to a soft, ragged whisper, completely devoid of bitterness. It was just a statement of fact. He gently reached up, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek. The touch was warm, a lingering echo of the love they had shared just hours before, when she was still his Clara and the world was still full of promise. But they both knew the illusion could never be pieced back together. The truth had set them free, but it had left them with absolutely nothing. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly, stepping back, his hand falling away from her face. Evelyn looked down at her wedding dress, a bitter, tragic smile touching her lips as the tears continued to fall. "Away from him," she whispered. "Somewhere where the name Vance can never find me again." Arthur nodded slowly. He walked over to the small table, picked up his tuxedo jacket, and draped it over his arm. He took one final, lingering look at the woman who had been his second chance, the sister of his ruin, and the greatest love of his life. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the vestry, stepping into the fading afternoon light, leaving the church, the marriage, and the ruins of his empire behind him in the shadows.